Thank all of you for being here. This is the very first briefing of any kind on Capitol Hill about drones and about their implications. And I would especially like to thank our panelists for leading us in a timely discussion of the United States combat drone policy, which has significant ramifications on both a domestic and an international level. Over the past 4 years, drone strikes have increased in number dramatically and are occurring in countries such as Pakistan and Yemen. Now, I remember back in 2005 when I was on a congressional delegation to Europe. We heard about drone strikes in a little town on the border of inside Pakistan called Damadola, in which 8 people were killed. And none of them had anything to do with any terrorist activity. And it was probably miraculous that the report even surfaced. In many cases, these drone strikes are occurring far from any internationally recognized battlefield. Despite claims by the Obama administration that the strikes cost few, if any, civilian casualties and are vital to our national security, there is increasing evidence that such strikes cause significant harm to civilian populations and serve as a powerful recruitment tool for terrorists. Thus far, the United States Congress has been denied the right to read the legal framework used by the administration to justify the drone strikes. This means that these strikes are being carried out with no transparency, no accountability, and no judicial review. Victims or targets of the drone strikes are obviously denied the right of due process. Innocent civilians and American citizens are being assigned the death penalty without so much as a trial. We do not know what measures, if any, the Joint Special Operations Command or the Central Intelligence Agency have for recognizing harm to civilian populations or to conduct investigations of who was killed. As the use of drones abroad becomes a permanent feature of our counterterrorism policy, it is more critical than ever that we push for transparency and accountability. We must reject the notion that Congress and the American people have to be kept in the dark on U.S. counterterrorism strategies. Simply put, drones must be subject to the same scrutiny and laws that other weapons that the United States employs. This is a new kind of war. It is defined less by geography than by technology. This change in definition allows the President, whether we're talking about Democrat or Republican here, to concentrate the power of declaring war into his or her hands. This change in war governance also allows the President to bypass the now out-of-date legal and constitutional infrastructure that was constructed to ensure war is a last resort, not a first resort. And this is a critical time for us to stand up and to say, we see what is happening here and we won't stand for it. Now, I stand here as a Democrat who challenged the policies of the Bush administration in taking this country to war based on lies, in advancing assassination. I stand here as an American first. I stand here as someone who is committed to our Constitution. And I call upon people of all political parties in this country, and of no parties, to become involved in this issue. Because our country's freedom is at stake whenever any one person in our country can arrogate to themselves the power of life and death through the means of technology executed by either the Central Intelligence Agency or the Department of Defense. This is not a small matter. And that's why it means so much to have this great set of panelists who will be addressing multiple aspects of our combat drone policy. We have with us Professor James Carvalho, who is the founding director of Stanford Law School's International Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Center. Professor Carvalho has dedicated his career to human rights, working on human rights issues in Latin America and in developing countries around the world. He's an expert on international human rights law and practice and is the co-author of a recent report on drones entitled, quote, "Living Under Drones, Death, Injury, and Trauma to Civilians from U.S. Drone Practices in Pakistan." We will hear also from Mr. Frank Januzzi. Frank Januzzi is the Deputy Executive Director of Amnesty International USA and is head of their Washington, D.C. office. He's an international affairs policy and political expert who most recently serves Chairman John Kerry as Policy Director for East Asian and Pacific Affairs for the Democratic staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. While in the Senate, Mr. Januzzi worked on human rights legislation and conducted field investigations into human rights and security concerns in numerous East Asian countries. We will hear from Mr. Bob Naiman. He's the Policy Director at the Just Foreign Policy and Rights on U.S. Foreign Policy. He's President of the Board of Truth Out and has previously worked as a policy analyst and researcher at the Center for Economic and Policy Research and Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. And our final panelist, by no means our least, Medea Benjamin. We're familiar with Medea on Capitol Hill. She's been a courageous spokesperson for human rights, not only here in Washington, but across the country and around the world. She's co-founder of the International Human Rights Organization, Global Exchange, and Code Pink. She's been an advocate for social justice for more than 30 years and is author of a book that has come out fairly recently, Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control. So we are going to begin with the panel. Who's going to, Dr. Carvalho?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. Thank you all of those present. Thank you in particular for convening this briefing today. In the United States, the dominant narrative about the use of drones in many places, but in particular Pakistan, about which I was speaking, has been a surgically precise and effective tool that makes the United States safer by enabling targeted killing of terrorists with minimal risks to U.S. forces and collateral impact.
Professor, excuse me, I just want to make sure, I know the sound isn't really good in this room. I would ask all the presenters to put the volume up just a little so the people at the back can hear you. Thank you.
Can you hear me with that?
Okay, thank you.
Again, the narrative has been one of surgical precision with minimal risks and minimal collateral impact.
After 9 months, I think that's off. After 9 months of intensive research, including 2 investigations that I led to Pakistan, more than 130 interviews with victims, witnesses, and experts, and review of thousands of pages of documentation and media reporting, our research team concluded that in at least 4 important respects, the narrative of precision, the narrative that has dominated in the United States about drones, is false.
First, drones kill a significant number of civilians. Second,
The presence of drones causes significant damage
to the society below them.
provoking psychological disorder and social breakdown.
Third, drones, and particular drone practices, raise significant legal issues. I limit my comments here to the practice of double tapping and possible targeting of first responders. Fourth, drones produce significant counterproductive outcomes. Let me turn to each of these points briefly. First, we found evidence that more civilians died in drone strikes than the United States government has admitted. From 2004 to 2012, drone strikes killed between 475 and 885 civilians in Pakistan alone, according to the Bureau of Investigator General. One example, a fatal strike on January 23, 2009, 3 days into the first Obama administration. Our research team met with Fahim Qureshi this past March. Just over 3 years after he was severely injured in a drone strike. Fahim was 14 when a missile fired from a U.S. drone struck the home where he was. It landed into the center of a nearby room, destroying the ceiling and roof and shattering all the windows. Fahim suffered a fractured skull as well as shrapnel wounds and burns on the left side of his body and face. The blast killed 7 people, including a cousin and 2 uncles. Fahim lost his left eye and his hearing in 1 year. He is one of many children under the age of 18 who have been injured in drone strikes in Pakistan, in addition to the 176 who have been killed, again, according to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism.
That is a large portion of the total number of civilians killed, noted earlier as between 475 and 885 in Pakistan.
Second, fear of attack has provoked psychological illness and has disrupted social life in the areas of Pakistan subject to drone surveillance and strikes. Our interviews reveal that strikes, as well as the permanent threatening presence of drones overhead constantly, create severe anxiety and tension for civilians in affected areas, that they undermine social structures, and that they promote increased animosity towards the United States. We also interviewed medical professionals who treat patients from the affected area, and they told us of the devastating impact of the presence of drones on their patients, many of whom suffer from PTSD, nervous disorders, and somatizations and related illnesses as a result of drones and drone strikes. Drone presence has also left many afraid to gather in groups, for weddings, funerals, or other events, thus undermining social structure. Some parents choose to keep their children home from school. Children, fearful and traumatized by drone strikes, have dropped out of classes. This fear is intensified by the practice of quote-unquote signature strikes. These strikes do not target particular individuals, but instead unknown groups of men with quote defining characteristics associated with terrorist activity. Just what those defining characteristics might be has not been made public. Earlier this year, however, the New York Times paraphrased the view shared by several officials that, quote, people in an area of known terrorist activity were found with the top Qaeda operative are probably up to no good, close quote. The Times also reported that some of the Obama administration have joked that when the CIA sees, quote, 3 guys doing jumping jacks, close quote, they think it is a terrorist training camp. Third, legal concerns. Many legal experts have questioned the legality of drone strikes in Pakistan. My colleague from Amnesty will address that issue in more detail. In particular, with states with which the United States is not at war. Our report summarizes these arguments and the report that
Who's next?
There is, however, an illegality of certain practices, which if confirmed, such as targeting first responders who are afforded our report documents instances of what's called double tapping. This is a practice of second or third strike at the same target shortly after an initial helpline is destroyed. Double tapping is well documented.
The Bureau of Investigative Journalism has confirmed more than a dozen instances in which secondary strikes have killed rescuers and first responders when they have approached a strike site to help the wounded. A father of 4 who lost a leg in a drone strike told our research team, quote, we and other people are so scared of drone attacks that now, when there is a strike, for 2 or 3 hours, no one goes close. Close quote. Attacking first responders, if intentional, would violate the principle of distinction and would contravene specific customary international law rules that protect the wounded and humanitarian assistance providers. As United Nations Special Rapporteur and legal scholar, Professor Christoph Haynes stated in no uncertain terms, quote, if civilian rescuers are indeed being intentionally targeted, there is no doubt about the law. Those strikes are a war crime, close quote. Fourth, strategic concerns. Our report documents at least 5 strategic concerns about the value of drone strikes. First, drones are only as accurate as the intelligence on which they are based. Similar intelligence led to massive over-arrests at Guantanamo. Recall that on the order of 80% of those detained there were released by U.S. authorities. What if the same proportion holds for those targeted and killed by U.S. drone strikes. Second, the vast majority of the militants targeted have been low-level insurgents who have been killed in circumstances in which there is little or no public evidence that they had the means or access to pose a serious threat to the United States or U.S. interests. According to CNN reporters, only 2% of those killed have been high-level targets. Third, drones undermine American credibility in Pakistan and throughout the region. Fourth, targeted killing and strike practices may establish dangerous precedents and undermine the rule of law. 76 countries now have drones, including China, Iran, and likely as well non-state actors. Would we want them to be able to use drones as we have used them in Pakistan? Finally, strike policies foment anti-American sentiment and may aid recruitment to to armed non-state actors. As 26 members of Congress, including you, Mr. Congressman, noted in a letter to President Obama earlier this year, drones are, quote, faceless ambassadors of death, close quote, to communities which otherwise know little about the United States. In rural areas of Pakistan, with very low literacy rates and little access to media, many people know almost nothing about the United States, except what they experienced through drone strikes. One 18-year-old that I spoke with admitted, frankly speaking, before the drone attacks, I didn't know anything about a country called America. Close quote. As a result, as another interviewee told our research team, quote, almost all people hate America, close quote, speaking about the people in his area. In fact, according to a 2012 poll by the Pew Research Center's Global Attitude Project, 74% of Pakistanis consider the United States an enemy. That's up from 64% 3 years ago. In his acceptance speech last week, President Obama told the nation that, quote, a decade of war is ending, close quote. While the large American military presence in Iraq and Afghanistan may be coming to a close, the United States continues to conduct a shadow drone war in Pakistan and elsewhere. For those on the ground in Pakistan, many of whom I met and interviewed earlier this year, a state of war, due in significant part to U.S. drone strikes, does exist in the tribal areas where they live. Finally, calling this briefing, Mr. Congressman, I believe is essential to shed light on U.S. drone practices. I urge you to continue, and I urge this Congress to continue to intensify this important oversight role. To date, the U.S. drone program has been shrouded in secrecy. It has cost the lives of scores of civilians, tarnished the reputation of the United States in the world, and undermined U.S. security. This state of affairs must not continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Audience to withhold your comments or your questions until the panel has finished the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you very much for the invitation to appear before you today. My name is Frank Januzzi. I'm the Deputy Executive Director and head of the Washington office for Amnesty International. On 9/11, I was sitting at my desk in the Dirksen building, along with a lot of House and Senate staff colleagues. And we watched live on CNN as first one and then a second of the Twin Towers came down. And like my colleagues on Capitol Hill and former colleagues at the State Department and friends and family around the country, I saw the smoke rising from the Pentagon across the Potomac, and I wondered how that day would change my life and the lives of our country forever. When I was ordered to evacuate the Dirksen building, I found myself sitting on the gutter at C Street Northeast next to Senator Biden, our cell phones inoperable, jammed from overuse of lines, and wondering what was going to come next. The targeted killing war of drones was not what was first in my mind as an appropriate response. But let me say at the outset of this briefing, Congressman, that as the head of the Washington office of Amnesty, I fully recognize the duty of the United States, as you do, to take robust action to protect the lives of American citizens and to bring to justice perpetrators of crimes. But in doing so, the United States government must respect its obligations under international human rights law, and in the exceptional situations also where international humanitarian law also applies. Those are obligations I believe the United States owes not just to the citizens of the world, whether they are in Pakistan or Yemen, but to ourselves. It's about who we are. Now, in a series of speeches over the last 2 years, the Obama administration has begun to reveal some details of the purported legal rationale for current policies and practices of the United States in the deliberate killing of terrorism suspects, including far from any recognized battlefield, and particularly through the use of drones. And the picture that is slowly emerging gives us grounds to conclude that current U.S. policies and practices for the intentional use of lethal force against terrorism suspects go far beyond what international human rights law permits and violate the fundamental human right not to be arbitrarily deprived of one's life. Now, some of the intentional killings in question, some of those conducted in the context of specific armed conflict, for instance, in Afghanistan, may be consistent with international human rights and international humanitarian law. But the policies in place also appear to permit extrajudicial executions, clearly in violation of international human rights law virtually anywhere in the world. Now, Amnesty International has 4 key concerns about the administration's practices. First, the administration continues to rely on a global war legal theory that treats the entire world as a battlefield between the United States and armed groups on which lethal force may apparently be used without regard to any human rights standards. Second, the administration's invocation of the right to use force in self-defense to justify the deliberate killing of virtually anyone suspected of involvement of any kind in relation to a wide range of armed groups, particularly through the adoption of this radical interpretation of the concept of imminent threats. This justification of self-defense needs much more scrutiny than it has received to date. Third, we're concerned about reports that a guilty until proven innocent standard is taken for military-age males who apparently are killed by a strike even if there's no specific evidence that they were directly participating in hostilities or a specific armed conflict. And fourth, the fact that the key factual and legal details of the killing program remain shrouded in such secrecy, which is why this briefing, Congressman, is so important, and I commend you for it. This fact highlights, as Professor Cavallaro has already said, the importance of Congress exercising its congressional oversight role. Now, these aspects of U.S. policy and practice are not only of concern in their own right, they also weaken the credibility of the United States as an advocate for respect for human rights around the world. They set dangerous precedents that other states may very well exploit, as Jim has already mentioned, and if unchecked, there's a very real risk that the U.S. global war doctrine will further corrode the very foundations of the international framework for protection of human rights. Finally, there is mounting evidence that the current U.S. policies and practices with respect to such killings may inadvertently be building support for the very armed groups and terror attacks that U.S. officials say provide justification for the strikes. Therefore, Amnesty International calls on the U.S. administration to do the following. First, disclose, reveal, fully elaborate the legal and factual details about U.S. policy and practices so that these targeted killings, signature strikes, and terrorist attack disruption strikes can be understood by the American people. End claims that the United States is authorized by international law to use lethal force anywhere in the world under this theory of global war against al-Qaeda and other armed groups and individuals. It is not authorized. Third, recognize the application of international human rights law to all U.S. counterterrorism operations, including those outside of U.S. territory. And finally, bring U.S. policies and practices in line with the United States' international human rights obligations, specifically by ensuring that any use of lethal force outside of a specific recognized zone of conflict complies fully with our obligations under international human rights law, and ensure that any use of lethal force inside these recognized battlefields, zones of conflict, also comports with international law, including the fact that they should recognize that if there is doubt, if there's doubt as to whether a person is a civilian, well, that person is to be considered a civilian. You don't declare them without evidence to be a combatant without evidence. And finally, ensuring that independent and impartial investigations are undertaken in all cases, the hundreds of cases, where extrajudicial killings appear to have taken place, with full respect for the rights of the family members of those killed and effective redress and remedy where killings are found to have taken place that are, in fact, unlawful. Congressman, I'm not an attorney, but I am here to speak to the policy issues and the moral and legal justifications of the U.S. government and its policies, and I look forward to your questions later. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Congressman Kucinich, for the opportunity to testify. I just returned from leading a 34-person delegation to Pakistan, where we were looking at the effects of the U.S. drone attacks. We found that drones are actually jeopardizing our national security by sowing the seeds of violence for decades to come. Drones help extremists recruit more discontented youth. In the tribal society of Waziristan, where the drones are attacking, we learn that people who have lost their family members in these deadly attacks are bound by the Pashtun cultural honor code called Pashtunwali to retaliate, to seek revenge. While for the most part we were received with great hospitality, we found intense anger over the violation of Pakistan's sovereignty and what people perceived as a cavalier attitude towards their lives. Quote, "To Americans, we are disposable people. Our lives are worth nothing," an angry young man told me. At a meeting at the Islamabad Bar Association, we were confronted by a group of lawyers yelling, "Americans, go home, go home. You are all a bunch of terrorists." A June 2012 Pew Research poll found that 3 out of 4 Pakistanis considered the U.S. their enemy. With a population of over 180 million people, that's 133 million people considering us their enemy. Surely that cannot be good for our national security. When Foreign Minister Hina Rabbani Kar was asked why there was so much animosity towards the United States, she replied with a one-word answer: drones. Suspending drone strikes won't automatically make us loved or stop Islamic radicals, but continuing the strikes only exacerbates the problem. Whether in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, or Somalia, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or Al-Shabaab may be callously killing innocent people, local police, and armed forces, but by capitalizing on the fear of drones and the intrusion of Westerners, they cast themselves as defenders of the people. The U.S. is using drones as if it were the only country to possess them. But the overwhelming U.S. dominance is coming to an end, with the technology falling into the hands of other nations, friends, and foes alike. According to the GAO report, 75 countries have now acquired drones, most of these for surveillance and reconnaissance missions, but many countries, including Israel, Britain, France, Russia, Turkey, China, India, and Iran, either have or are seeking weaponized drones. Israel is the world's leading exporter of drones, with more than 1,000 sold in 42 countries. China is producing some 25 different types. Iran has already deployed its own reconnaissance drones, and weapons-ready models are in the works. In October, the Iranian government announced a new long-range drone that can fly 2,000 kilometers, and just weeks ago, an Iranian drone launched by Hezbollah flew into the Israeli airspace for 3 hours, beaming back live images of secret military bases before being shot down by the Israeli military. A 2012 GAO report said that certain terrorist organizations have acquired small, more rudimentary drones, such as radio-controlled aircraft, that are available through the internet. But if terrorists were able to equip these drones with even small quantity of chemical or biological weapons, the report said, it could produce lethal results. The proliferation of drones should evoke reflection on the precedent that the U.S. is setting by killing anyone it wants, wherever it wants, on the basis of secret information. Other nations and non-state entities are surely watching and bound to start acting in a similar fashion. And here at home, the use of surveillance drones is about to explode, thanks in large measure to the Congressional Unmanned Systems Caucus. Self-described as, quote, industry's voice on Capitol Hill, This group of 50 lawmakers has close ties with the powerful industry lobby called the Association of Unmanned Vehicle Systems International. The caucus not only pushes to lift export restrictions, but also to relax regulations that limit the use of drones domestically. It pushed through legislation that requires the FAA to fully integrate drones into the U.S. airspace by September 15, 2015. Some police departments have already applied for and received permission to test out various kinds of drones. From Miami to Houston to Mesa County, Colorado, police departments have drones that can be equipped with tasers, stun batons, grenade launchers, shotguns, tear gas canisters, and rubber bullets. These drones can also be outfitted with high-powered cameras, thermal imaging devices, license plate readers, and radar. In the near future, they might add biometric recognition that can track individuals based on height, age, gender, skin color, and will soon have the capacity to see through walls and ceilings. All the pieces are lined up to introduce routine aerial surveillance into American life, a development that would profoundly change the character of public life in the United States. This is especially worrisome since our privacy laws are not strong enough to ensure that the new technology will be used responsibly and consistent with democratic values. Drones at home also pose a threat to our safety because the technology is still in its early stages. In 2009, the Air Force admitted that more than a third of their drones have crashed, and in August 2012, a drone in Afghanistan collided with a C-130 cargo plane, forcing it to make an emergency landing. In June, the military's largest drone, the Global Hawk, did not crash in a far-flung overseas outpost, but right in southern Maryland. The burden is now squarely on Congress and the public to push back against the proliferation of drones as a military and law enforcement tool. Peace groups such as Code Pink, Voices for Creative Nonviolence, and Catholic Workers are part of a growing movement protesting at U.S. bases where lethal drones are remotely operated, and at the headquarters of drone manufacturers. Faith-based leaders are questioning the morality of killer drones, and more people of conscience are calling for international guidelines to curb robotic warfare, as the world community has done in the cases of landmines and cluster bombs. We are calling on friends in Congress to act as a counterweight to the pro-drone caucus and the drone lobby. We need Congress people who will stand up to the lethal presidential policy run amok, who will advocate on behalf of the privacy and safety of Americans at home and on behalf of the rule of law overseas, who will demand that the CIA revert to being an intelligence gathering agency, who will say that after 10 years of waging war on terror by terrorizing other people, it's time to try another way. A way that includes speeding up the U.S. troop exit from Afghanistan, stopping the deadly drone strikes, promoting peace talks, and helping to educate and provide economic opportunities for people in the conflict zones. The response to the brutal shooting of the 15-year-old Pakistani girl Malala Yousafzai points in that direction. While the police undertook a nationwide search for her aggressors, Malala's shooting awoke Pakistanis' silent majority who were saying enough to Taliban threats and oppression. Pakistanis organized rallies, and the girls, even in Swat Valley, expressed their determination to return to school. Citizens delivered 1 million signatures to the government demanding free and compulsory education. Right now, less than half of Pakistani children are enrolled in schools, and in the tribal areas, the figure is less than 20%, and even worse in Yemen and Somalia. For the cost of one Hellfire missile, we could educate 750 children a year. For the cost of one Predator drone, we could send 30,000 children to school. What a great way to fight extremism, build a better future for the youth of these nations, and make ourselves safer by winning the hearts and minds of the people. Schools, not drones, should not just be a catchy slogan, but a radical shift away from a 10-plus year failed policy of endless war towards one based on making peace with our Muslim neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to hear next from Mr. Bob Naiman, Policy Director at Just Foreign Policy.
So what I'm going to talk about is about drone strikes in U.S. foreign policy, can Congress do something and what could Congress do? So first, some political context as I see it. I don't think anyone would argue, probably if I would say that for the last 10 years, Congress hasn't done very much in this area. There's certainly been some activity, which Representative Kucinich has been a leader on. But overall, there's been relatively little activity, particularly on the foreign policy side. Second, I think it would be extremely helpful if we could change that, and if members of Congress would get more active on this, and that letters, resolutions, statements would be more frequent. I think, in this room, this should be an easy sell, but my experience, not enough people are aware of these dynamics. I think Congress doing something is intrinsically important in itself, in addition to whatever the thing is. The reason being that the media, the public, and the administration take cues from what Congress is talking about. Congress isn't talking about something that is perceived as not very controversial. In fact, you see this in the press on this issue regularly. Congress hasn't said anything, Congress hasn't said anything. So, and that's bad, because it shapes the press coverage, it shapes the public perception, creates the image that this is not a controversial policy. I think that there is untapped demand, actually. I think this room shows conversations I've had with people in the last week. People are looking, there's a buzz around this now. Like, people are asking me, what's the strategy? What's happening now? And I can't tell you, it hasn't coalesced yet. But people are talking about it. And so I'm pretty confident that in the next year, we'll see more activity. But still, I think it's important to change the political psychology around this issue, because there's been a perception that Congress can't do anything. I don't think it's as hard for Congress to do something about this as some people seem to think. There's the conventional wisdom that Congress can't do anything because no one cares, because no U.S. soldiers are being killed by the policy. I think this conventional wisdom is completely wrong. No U.S. soldiers are being killed in Honduras, and yet 100 members of Congress are willing to sign letters about human rights in Honduras. These letters get press and pressure the administration. No U.S. soldiers are being killed in Bahrain. The members of Congress are willing to sign letters about human rights in Bahrain, and these letters get press and pressure the administration. Conversely, plenty of U.S. soldiers were killed in Afghanistan before 2009, and Congress didn't do very much about that. So whether or not American soldiers are being killed is not as important as many people seem to think. It's not, I think, the key thing driving whether we can do something. There's another conventional wisdom that Congress can't do anything because Americans support the policy. But in fact, most Americans have no idea what the policy is. So to say that they support it is kind of meaningless. To the extremely limited extent that the administration has deigned to share information publicly, it has made two central claims: that drone strikes are narrowly targeted on top-level terrorist leaders, and that civilian casualties have been extremely rare. The record of independent reporting, as Professor Carvalho mentioned, suggests that these two claims, as President Obama might put it, are the biggest whoppers of the drone strike policy. So if the public, quote-unquote, supports the policy, what the public is supporting is a policy whose only official public notice has been two big whoppers, a policy that doesn't exist in reality. If the American people found out what the real policy is, I'm sure that they would not support it. And this is why strategies to force an increase in transparency are key to reforming the policy. I think a large part of the reason not much has happened has simply been a question of focus. Between 2001 and 2009, very little happened in Congress on the war in Afghanistan. People were focused on the war in Iraq. When troops were drawn down from Iraq and escalated in Afghanistan, people started to focus on Afghanistan, and Congress started taking action. And now the troops are being drawn down from Afghanistan, we have an opportunity to focus on drone strikes. I think the main dynamics are political. Obama is reelected, as we all know. This should create more political space. We don't have to, everybody who's been in conversations with administration officials on war issues over the past few years knows that the election that we just got through it loomed large in their consciousness and loomed large in the consciousness of people in Congress. That's done. That's out of the way, so we could have a different conversation now. The issue's getting more press attention. Months ago, already, before the election, before all these recent reports came out, we got 26 signers on the Kucinich-Conyers signature strike letter. That was without a huge push from a lot of groups. That was just really a small push that got 26 members to sign. And I am quite convinced that more people are ready to push now if we come up with a good strategy. I think it's very likely to be more useful to have a lot of members doing something more modest than to have very few members do something profound. It's more likely to get press. It's more likely to produce the impression that the policy is controversial. It's more likely to show that members care. It's more likely to produce a change in policy. Personally, I'd rather see 50 members on a letter than 25 members on a resolution. That's just me. But I think the thing that the press would notice is the number, not the what. So therefore, I think we should be looking for realistic, pragmatic things that we can do to reform the current drone strike policy. At least some of these things should be things that we can engage people outside the Beltway on, because that's going to lead to a lot more public education. So here's 5 ideas. Professor Carvalho mentioned the secondary follow-up strikes. I think this would be a very good target for members of Congress to start talking about. I don't think there's been activity on this yet. I've spoken with some congressional offices that are concerned about this. In one way, this is a very good issue because the overwhelming consensus of international legal experts is that it is a slam dunk that it is illegal to target rescuers. And even the U.S. ambassador to Pakistan, I asked him, so we all agree if you hit an ambulance with a cross on top, that's illegal, right? And he said, yeah, we agree that's illegal. So we've got that. What's happening in Waziristan, of course, is that there are areas where there is no Red Cross. And other people come, and those people are being targeted. Except, when we challenged the U.S. ambassador on this at 2 meetings, he denied this was taking place. He denied that the U.S. is targeting rescuers, and he denied that the U.S. is conducting secondary strikes. So this, I think, is an opportunity. We have all this independent reporting, like living under drones. There's been stuff in the press about secondary strikes, double tap strikes. And here we have the U.S. ambassador, acting U.S. ambassador at the time, to back to that saying, no, this isn't happening. First of all, it should trouble everyone. I mean, there's just a lack, the policy should trouble everyone. But that we could be in this case where one thing is happening in the press, and we meet the U.S. ambassador to Pakistan, he says, no, that's not happening. And the very fact that we could even have this conversation with a U.S. official on the record was kind of spectacular, because that never happens, that a U.S. official goes on the record about this. So I think this is an opportunity, I hope, for members of Congress to say, oh, well, okay, you have officially denied this. So you should have no problem if we state it as U.S. policy not to do this. So I'm hoping that members of Congress will take this up, codifying the ambassador's denial. And the thing is, for a lot of the things we might go after, administration officials will say, as the U.S. ambassador said, oh, this is murky in international law. And of course, lawyers, you can always find someone to argue. Except that this isn't murky. Even in a lawful conflict, it's illegal to target rescuers. So even if they say, oh, but it's legal, the war is legal, never mind. It's still illegal to target rescuers. So this is a good attack, I think. Badina mentioned the issue of getting the CIA out of drone strikes. Many of you probably saw the Washington Post editorial a few weeks ago. Washington Post said the CIA should get out of drone strikes. Any drone strikes should be conducted by the military. Human Rights Watch and other groups have called for this as well. Human rights groups calling for this have said, whatever you think about the military, they're much more transparent and accountable to outside groups than the CIA is. Much more accountable to compliance with international law, much easier to present information to and get a response from. In addition to the issue of CIA focusing on its core competence. So I think the fact that human rights groups are calling for this, and the Washington Post editorial board, which, as you all know, is not, the most liberal-minded on foreign policy issues. When we were in Pakistan, the acting U.S. ambassador acknowledged to us that the U.S. government has an official count of the number of civilians it thinks have been killed in Pakistan, and that this number is classified. Congress could ask, why is this number classified? What is so top secret about the U.S. government's official count of the number of civilians who've been killed in Pakistan? Why not tell Congress and the American people what you think this number is? And of course, that would be great because for us, for critics, because then we could compare it to other reports and say, no, actually we think that that's wrong and here's why. Right now we can just say, we know that you're not telling the truth when you say exceedingly rare, but if we actually had a number, we could compare it to other numbers. So that would be a big increase in transparency. In Afghanistan, civilians who've been harmed by the U.S. military action can be compensated. There's a mechanism in place for that. There's currently no program in place to compensate civilians who have been harmed by CIA drone strikes in Pakistan. Although, according to Civic, Congress has already authorized and appropriated money that could be used for this purpose. So we could do it. And we challenged the acting U.S. ambassador to Pakistan on this, and he said, yeah, there's no reason why the U.S. couldn't do this in principle. There just isn't a program in place. So this is something Congress could make happen very easily. The administration would have no argument. And I think it would have spillover effects, because if you have to compensate, then you have to count. And you have to do so accountably. Because people could come and say, I was harmed, and you have to adjudicate their case. And if you pay them, then you can't say they weren't harmed. And if you don't pay them, then you have to say why. Finally, 4 of the so-called signatures that the U.S. is reported to be using to target signature drone strikes, I think are slam dunk illegal under international humanitarian law. Military-age mail-in area of known terrorist activity, consorting with known militants, armed men traveling in trucks in Al-Qaeda-controlled area, and suspicious camp in Al-Qaeda-controlled area. So we tried to go after signature strikes before in one way. I think this could be an even more strategic way to go after signature strikes, be to pick a subset of signature strikes that are slam dunk illegal in international law, and at least challenge the administration to confirm or deny that they're conducting these strikes. So these are just 5 ideas. I think there are other ideas floating around, so I'm not saying that these are the 5, but it is a 5, I think, that have the property of being plausible, that a bunch of members of Congress could sign on to even move, and that the administration would have no good answer for why they can't respond. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Please join me in thanking the panelists for their presentation. We are now going to go to questions, and I will ask people to stand up. I would ask you to keep your questions directed to the topic at hand. We have panelists who have come from all over for this. I want to make sure that their time is valuable. If any questions directed to me, I'll answer it as quickly as possible. We do have a vote on sometime soon, and if I have to leave, I'm going to ask Jadala, who's my foreign policy person, as well as my legislative director, to take over. Okay, questions. The gentleman, yes.
Hi, my name is Razi Hashmi. I'm a master's student at George Mason School of Public Policy, and also working with Congresswoman Sheila Jackson's office. I commend Congressman and all of you for being here today and talking about this very important subject. My question is, are you advocating eliminating lethal drones only, or all drones, including surveillance? And what are the counterterrorism policy alternatives to the drone strike? Thank you.
Anyone who wants to answer that.
I think we have different answers.
We'll start. You hit the mic.
Oh. Well, yeah, repeat the question. Oh, I repeat the question. Okay, so against any drone strikes, any use of drones?
Specifically in Pakistan.
Specifically in Pakistan. So my feeling is, I'm more interested, as I said, so I look at these questions from the point of view of what could we get 30 to 50 members of Congress to do. I'm pretty sure we cannot get 30 to 50 members of Congress to say shut down drone strikes completely. We've got 20, when we did the letter, one of the things that I had in mind was, this is a test. Who can we get to sign this letter? We got 26 members to sign the letter. So I'm pretty sure that we are very far away from getting 218 members of the House to say no drone strikes anywhere. So I'm more interested in seeing what could we get a bunch of members of Congress to do by looking at the most egregious aspects of the current policy and seeing if we could organize members of Congress around that.
Well, I think many of the groups that I represent that have been protesting would certainly say that where the U.S. is violating the sovereignty of the Pakistani people, that the Pakistani government might have back in the early 2000s, according to WikiLeaks, agreed to pretend they were against these strikes but allow them to happen. That has completely reversed as the Pakistani government has seen how counterproductive the drone strikes are and how they turn people not only against the United States but against the Pakistani government, and makes it harder for the Pakistani military to deal with this because they're seen as collaborating with the United States. So I would say that the U.S. should stop the use of drone strikes in Pakistan, should allow the Pakistanis to deal with this problem. And what they have told us is one of the best things the U.S. could do is get the troops out of Afghanistan, because then there wouldn't be Afghan Taliban in Pakistan trying to get back into Afghanistan to fight American soldiers. That would be the number one positive thing to help the Pakistanis. And as soon as I think the U.S. stopped using the drone strikes, the Pakistanis said they're not against drones per se. They just don't want them to be coming from foreigners. In fact, they are producing their own drones now, and they would like to have the chance to deal with the Taliban themselves instead of having the U.S. do it.
Because I think it's important that, should I borrow that microphone? I think it's really important that, speaking as a member of Congress, that there should be some clarity about what drones represent. The use of armed drones in the sovereign territory of another country is an act of war. You cannot call it anything else. Let's look at it how we would describe it. Let's say if China or some other nation violated our airspace, was within the United States territory, and launched a drone strike on a U.S. citizen or on a U.S. community. That would be an act of war. We have no question about it. Now, if we can understand that with respect to how we would view this, we need to understand how it can be and should be viewed abroad. This is an act of war. That's number one. Under our Constitution, Congress and Congress alone has the ability to declare war. So one of the problems that the drones reflect upon is an historic undercutting of the role of Article 1 in the Constitution, that the presidency, which is supposed to be a co-equal branch of government, has achieved a dominant role in the life of the nation, so much so that it has obliterated Congress's fundamental, historically important role of not just being a counterbalance, but of being the institution that has to make the decision as to whether or not deadly force should be used in the name of the United States of America. So that's number one. Number two, absent any internationally approved action, the action by any nation within the sovereign territory of another nation in taking military action within that other sovereign nation is a violation of international law, period. To plan that, by the way, to plan such action is, and of itself, a violation of international law. Let's not get squishy about this. This is really clear. And then you get into the question of people who have been killed, who are innocent civilians, who, as the one report that Professor Carvalho talks about, 2% of those who have perished in these are said to have some kind of
High level.
yeah, some high-level target value, whatever that means. We're killing innocent civilians here. We're summarily executing them. This is not a small matter because they're being deprived of their human rights. We are told that in the United States that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, obliterating due process of law here and as well as the principle of it abroad. So this is why we're together here. So that question is not a small matter. And what should Congress do? Look, drones for surveillance are one thing. Drones that are armed combat drones that are put into other countries, that should not exist. It should not. Are drones a potential weapon of choice? Theoretically, if our nation was at war, you know, some war theory, use whatever you can to defend the country. But that's not where we are here. This is aggression. And we've got to know the difference between offense and defense. And so, you know, I just wanted to make sure that I took the opportunity to respond directly to that question. And Medea Benjamin raises another point which we sure better get into, and that is the domestic application of drone technology. Because it's not too far away where, you know, the violations of privacy that are going on here in the United States already, which are extraordinary. We're not too far away from a time when those drones will be armed and will be used. Again, jumping over the same due process which the current use of drones is doing internationally. So let's get to the next question. Yes?
I'm Ty Gray from Internews. I have two questions. One concerns the use of chips. There's when I was in Pakistan, they were talking about chips that were being handed out by CIA to individuals to identify the potential targets. And I also heard that there were someone telling me in Waziristan that some of these chips are now ending up on the black market and they're being bought and sold to assassinate individuals inside Waziristan. And my next question is, can you speak to the enormous amount of attention that's been brought on these government officials that were brutally murdered in Benghazi, but the lack of attention to the over 3,500 people that have been murdered inside Waziristan?
We're not going to talk about that tonight, but let's answer.
So, and I'm not sure if this is on. Okay. It's on?
Yeah.
Great. So with regard to chips, and let me just provide background for those not necessarily as informed of this issue as you are. One of the things that we heard when we were in Pakistan, speaking with people who live in FATA, the federally administered tribal areas, and in particular the North Waziristan Agency, is that it is widely believed that one of the ways in which targeting is done is by the placing of small chips into which a signal can be locked so that a drone may fire a missile and hit that chip, that target. And so what people say is that these chips are then placed in locales where someone may have reason to believe that there is an Al-Qaeda operative or a Taliban operative, etc. and that in turn,
Like a beacon.
yeah, they're homing devices so that a drone would have the coordinates of that chip and then could lock into that chip and fire a Hellfire missile to strike that chip. So where that chip is placed, and once information is provided to those operating the drones, once that chip is placed, then a strike could be called down to hit that chip. The consequence of this widespread belief is great distrust and significant information and discussion among people in North Waziristan about who has chips, who's placing chips, fear and distrust between and among people in communities, etc. Now, can I confirm, or can we confirm, that this is accurate and that this is the way, or one of the ways in which drone strikes are targeted? Unfortunately, or fortunately, however it is, no, because we were not able to visit the sites to see whether there are chips. It would be difficult to actually to find the chips. And people who are responsible for the chips are also unlikely to admit as much. So there's a great deal of speculation, there's a great deal of uncertainty, but what is known and what is important here is that the belief, which is widespread, that chips are being placed, has served to undermine or to a significant degree, the social cohesion in North Waziristan, because people have great fear of their neighbors, of others with whom they interact. They don't know who might be placing a chip. They don't know who might be Taliban, and so the levels of distrust and anxiety and paranoia have increased according to our interviews.
Yes, I'm Ed Spanos with Executive Intelligence Review. I'd like to raise another thing which Congress could do, which is to initiate impeachment proceedings. An important step in that direction is House Concurrent Resolution 107, introduced by Walter Jones with bipartisan support, which declares that if the president initiates war against another country without congressional authorization, that's an impeachable offense. And as the congressman has just said, the use of drones itself is an act of war against another nation. Now, when Bush and Cheney were involved in war crimes, many of us thought they should be impeached, and others said, well, we'll take care of it, we'll get a Democratic president, and that will eliminate the problem. Well, it's made it worse. And as the Washington Post series pointed out, what now is happening is you've got what Obama is doing is institutionalizing this policy of drones, trying to lock it in for future administrations under the guise of this being a bipartisan consensus. And the strongest and most effective remedy on this is impeachment. And it's the first step, I would say, rallying support among other members of Congress for the House Concurrent Resolution 107.
Well, let me just respond to that, since I'm a member of Congress and relates to our institution. First of all, you have to have an awareness in the Congress of its responsibility under Article 1, Section 8. Until you have Congress ready to exercise its authority and take a stand, the consequences of the action that we're talking about are not going to be observed. So, part of what has to happen is that Congress has to be reminded of what its role is constitutionally. Now, in a 7th grade civics class that I took many years ago, we were told about 3 branches of government and what their distinct responsibilities were. Congress needs to be not just reminded and exhorted, but pushed and to stand up for its Article 1 responsibilities here. And when Congress does that, then the other things can come into consequence. But until it does, it just becomes a dramatic discussion about whether or not action should be taken with respect to
Yeah, there's been a series of CRS reports about the history of the War Powers Resolution, and it's really quite fascinating. I recommend it to anyone that's concerned with this. There have been a number of attempts by members of Congress, and Representative Kucinich was involved with more than one of these, to try and get courts to enjoin administration action in this area. And the courts have tended to the view that if Congress wants the president to stop doing something, they should say so, basically. So what that means is that what Representative Kucinich said, that the main thing is getting members of Congress if you think that the administration is doing policy X and you don't want the administration to do policy X, you need to get members of Congress to open their mouths and say, we want to get the administration to stop doing policy X.
Diala is going to chair the meeting at this point. I have to go vote. Thanks to all of you for being here. How much longer? How much longer do we have the room?
I have it till 11:30, but I think they're flexible.
Okay, we have until 11:30, and we're on different times.
Thank you.
Does anyone else want to answer that, or should we go to the next question? Should we go to the next question?
My name is Georgina Shanley, and I'm with the Node Loans, KNOWDRONES group. And it would appear to me that the major issue with this is that the American administration believes that American lives are more valuable than any other life. And I think that that's the basic problem. And I think what Mr. Naiman is saying with going incrementally to Congress to ask for little tweaks and little touches of changes here and there is good, but it's not really addressing the main issue of depriving people of lives illegally by civilian group, which is the CIA, in countries where we're not at war. And I believe that the human rights organizations and United Nations as well should really step to the plate and call for an international ban on lethal drones and even surveillance drones. So the answers, I didn't hear all of the answers to the question posed by this gentleman about an international ban on drones, lethal drones. And I'd like to hear that too.
So I think you raise a very important point. Let me just start by saying the research and documentation and the report that we wrote, which is in Living Under Drones. And I'll do some promo, livingunderdrones.org. You can download the report and see media coverage and other information that's not in the report, and interviews and videos, etc., about drones and the effects of drones on civilians in Pakistan. The report was written from a framework of what the existing international law is and a framework of strategy concerns what maximizes or minimizes the security interests of the United States, which is the government in this case that's firing drones. Now that's all well and good, and that is what I'm, I would say, qualified to speak about. A separate matter that we don't discuss in the report, which you raise and which is essential, is what is the state of the law on drones specifically now, and what will the state of the law on drones be in 5, 10, or 15 years? In real time, one of the concerns that is in the report is that the United States' actions are pushing the development of law in a direction that facilitates widespread use of drones by many countries for many purposes. International law does not fall from the sky. International law is created by human beings. So in real time, we can decide what we collectively, all of us, what we want international law to be. Do we think, and I mean by we, citizens, but also state actors, international bodies, NGOs that you cite, for instance, do we want a paradigm for drones similar to, say, chemical and biological weapons, which is a framework of prohibition because of their dangerousness and lethal impact on civilians and others? Or do we want some sort of non-proliferation regime as with nuclear weapons? That's a choice we get to make. And I'll just say as a lawyer, that's a choice that should be made not necessarily by lawyers, but ought to be made by citizens, and it ought to be made not necessarily on legal concerns alone, but on ethical concerns. What do we think is right and just? And these are real questions that we, in this society and other societies, have to answer. And the law might not have an answer about what's right and just, but often it does not.
Let me add briefly to my fellow panelists answer, this invocation of a global war, legal theory, by the administration, this is one of the principal concerns that Amnesty International has. And it touches on the gentlelady's question, because many of the legal arguments that have been made by the administration seem to imply that U.S. citizens have significantly different rights with respect to being subject to lethal drone strikes than would non-U.S. citizens. But Amnesty International is concerned that this represents a grave erosion of the very fundamental nature of the most basic of human rights, and that is the right to life, to liberty, and to fair trial of every human being is to be respected without discrimination on the basis of their nationality. So for the United States government to assert this global war legal theory that essentially turns everyone in the world, but especially apparently non-U.S. citizens, into potential enemies subject to a lethal drone strike or other lethal execution, is extraordinarily corrosive to the basic fabric of international human rights law.
I'm happy to hang around outside. I just want to say, not be too glib about this chipping around the edges thing. Like, suppose we could get members of Congress to put real pressure on the policy of secondary strikes. Suppose that we could get the House to pass sense of Congress resolution. It's the policy of the United, or language. It's the sense of the House that the U.S. should not engage in secondary strikes or target rescuers. Suppose that as a result of that political pressure, the administration stopped doing that. A bunch of people would not get killed who will be killed if the policy continues. So, is that chipping around the edges? Do those lives matter? Compare that to the fact that, there's you need 218 to pass the House. Right now, we couldn't get a bill passed through the House saying that the war in Afghanistan should end in the next 6 months. So I think that I know it's very frustrating. You come from your demonstration with your Stop Drone sign, and you come to Congress, and you're in a different environment. But I do think that it's worth thinking about what the dynamics are here, and the fact that Congress doing nothing has a real cost. In order for Congress to do something, the something has to be realistic.
I wanted to second Bob's suggestion about Congress focusing on the role of the CIA, because right now there is so much focus on Petraeus and his sex life, but it does mean that there is an opening to look at the role of the CIA now that he has stepped down. During his tenure, he was not only in charge of the drone program in Pakistan, but also in getting permission to use signature strikes in Yemen, and also asked for more drones for the CIA to begin operations in northern Africa, particularly Mali. So I think this is a really good time to take advantage of that and do what has been done in the past in church commissions and other times when Congress saw the CIA out of control and is trying to rein in the CIA, turn it back into an intelligence gathering agency and not into what it's become, which is a paramilitary agency.